MTC. Q-13 number 1. The absolute silence was interrupted, from time to time, by the birds going in and out of the broken windows. In the center of the patio, surrounded by the vestiges of wooden verandas with hanging empty pots where flowers had once blossomed, there was a large aging tree, its roots spreading in all directions. I remained motionless and unsure of what I should do next. My friend, who had entered the place ahead of me, had vanished. The darkness of the night added to the feeling that I was, not in a house where people had once lived and laughed, but in a graveyard the boundaries of which I was violating. The chill in the air seemed a foreboding of terrible things to come. As if attracted by an invisible magnet, I went into a room, and smelled the mold of ages, which overwhelmed me. And then the door closed, as if pushed to by an invisible hand. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC. Q-13 number 2. There is obviously a wide gap between the promises of the 1948 Declaration and the real world of human rights violations. 1948. Insofar as we sympathize with the victims, we may criticize the UN and its member governments for failing to keep their promises. However, we cannot understand the gap between human rights ideals and the real world of human rights violations by sympathy or by legal analysis. Rather, it requires investigation by the various social sciences of the causes of social conflict and political oppression, and of the interaction between national and international politics. The UN introduced the concept of human rights into international law and politics. The field of international politics is, however, dominated by states and other powerful actors, such as multinational corporations, that have priorities other than human rights. It is a leading feature of the human rights field that the governments of the world proclaim human rights but have a highly variable record of implementing them. We must understand why this is so. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC. Q-13 number 3. The graph above shows the percentage of U.S. adults who say that private citizens should or should not be allowed to pilot drones in certain locations. When it comes to what rules should apply to drone use, 54% of survey respondents think drones should not be allowed to fly near people's homes. 54%. Just 11% think this should be allowed, while 34% think it is okay in certain circumstances but not in others. 11%, 34%. More than half the respondents say private citizens should not be allowed to pilot drones near crime scenes or traffic accidents, while 45% say this practice should not be allowed at events like concerts or rallies. 45%. By comparison, U.S. adults are more broadly accepting of drone use by private citizens in locations such as beaches or public parks. More people say the practice should be allowed than not allowed. For each of the possible locations for drone use asked about in the survey, more than 1/4 of U.S. adults say it depends on the circumstances as to whether private citizens should be allowed to pilot drones in that location or not. 4-1. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC. Q-13 number 4. Creativity is about connecting the dots, making connections between things that have never before been linked. It is the ability to recognize the possibilities that exist within any scenario and the opportunities in every situation. Changing the game starts with seeing the unseen within even the ordinary. Out of a plain slab of marble, Michelangelo carved his best work. Michelangelo. German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer once said, "Talent hits a target no one else can hit. Genius hits a target no one else can see." Arthur Schopenhauer. Creative solutions and breakthroughs come from viewing something differently and discovering what others have missed. Patents for novel ideas, processes and methodologies are simply the tangible results of someone seeing something differently than the world had ever seen it before. Paradigms shift when people come along who see how to connect the dots, apply multiple perspectives and build a bridge between unrelated ideas. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC. Q-13 number 5. Several studies find situational cues can radically change people's mental set about what is normatively appropriate in a social dilemma. For example, different groups of students in one study played a dilemma game according to identical rules, with only the name of the game varying. Students were much more generous and cooperative when the game was called the community game than when the same game was labeled the Wall Street game. In an even more subtle manipulation of social norms, half the students in one experiment were primed for interdependence, by completing sentences containing words such as group, friendships, or together, while the other half were primed for independence, by completing sentences containing words such as independent, individual, or self-contained. The students who were primed for interdependence were later more cooperative and trusting in a public goods dilemma. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC. Q-13 number 6. Curiously, for all the value we ascribe to our ability to speak, language could have a dulling effect on the rest of our perceptions. Humans have developed and refined a communication system that can convey extremely specific information. It's possible that as a result we have become less reliant on our other senses for gleaning information from our surroundings. If I can verbalize my anxiety, what need have you to focus on my body language, smells, or other physical or psychological signs that might accompany these feelings? If I tell you that I've just placed some fresh strawberries on the kitchen table, why should you have to detect their presence by sense of smell? In the absence of spoken language, other animals have to rely on their senses to detect sensory cues or the emotional states of others. It's one key reason why we may be less perceptive than many other animals. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC. Q-13 number 7. Suppose we know that Paula suffers from an acute phobia. Paula. If we reason that Paula is afraid either of snakes or spiders, and then establish that she is not afraid of snakes, we will conclude that Paula is afraid of spiders. Paula. However, our conclusion is reasonable only if Paula's fear really does concern either snakes or spiders. Paula. If we know only that Paula has a phobia, then the fact that she's not afraid of snakes is entirely consistent with her being afraid of heights, water, dogs, or the number 13. Paula. 1-3. More generally, when we are presented with a list of alternative explanations for some phenomenon, and are then persuaded that all but one of those explanations are unsatisfactory, we should pause to reflect. Before conceding that the remaining explanation is the correct one, consider whether other plausible options are being ignored or overlooked. The fallacy of false choice misleads when we're insufficiently attentive to an important hidden assumption, that the choices which have been made explicit exhaust the sensible alternatives. MTC. Good job. Let's start. MTC. Q-13 number 8. Dr. Davidson and his colleagues have shown that there is asymmetry in the prefrontal cortex reflecting our affective style. Davidson. When there is more activity in the right side of the prefrontal cortex, it correlates with negative emotions such as worry, sadness, and anger. If the left side is more active, we tend to be in a positive emotional state, with a sense of well-being, enthusiasm, even joy. Developing a greater ability to recover, then, should show up as a shift in the relative activity between the two sides of the prefrontal cortex. The left side ought to become more active as the right side calms down. In fact, that happened with a group that practiced mindfulness meditation for 8 weeks. 8. They had greater activity in the left side, reported a stronger sense of well-being, and even showed a positive change in immune system function, as measured by influenza antibody titers. Those who had the most activity in the left prefrontal cortex had the strongest immune system response, suggesting a connection between overall well-being and the health of the immune system. According to Dr. Davidson's study on the correlation of prefrontal cortex with affective style, when the left side of prefrontal cortex is more activated, the feeling of happiness is increased with the boosted immune system. Davidson. MTC. Good job.